There's not a year that passes by without some low-budget off-season horror film attempting to claw out what few dollars it can before fading into obscurity along with all the other dreck, only to be occasionally pulled out as a last-minute idea for a sleepover or Halloween party. Moderately interesting premise that isn't actually that original? Check. Creepy-sounding Latin word is the title? Check. Star that is actually famous for something that's actually popular but still unknown enough to the public so that she can be hired on the cheap? Check and check. While the trailer made the film sound like an interesting one to see, the execution of the feature film as a whole just is confusing and hard to follow. The main problem is that we see the events of the past and the present kind of interspersed throughout the film, and while that can work, if given the right film, especially if the stuff that's supposed to happen in the past is left ambiguous and we learn it, and we kind of learn about it as an audience, the way it's executed in this film, we pretty much learn the circumstances of what happened in the past fairly early on, making a lot of the scenes from the past that we see just ultimately pointless to the overall story. Another key problem is that it tries to set rules for what the mirror does at the beginning of the film, but there's just no real consistency with what it actually does. I mean, it's creative in the sense, oh, it messes with people's minds, but then it's just a case of, is it absorbing their life? Is it just driving them crazy for no reason? There's no consistency in what the mirror or the entity inside it is actually doing. And this gets especially worse as we get into the third act, where they try to effectively take cues from stuff like The Shining, stuff like, oh, now there's all these creepy ghost people, oh, it's the ghosts of the previous victims. Just, no. No. If it doesn't serve a point, don't add it. That was just the biggest problem I had with it, is like, oh yeah, we've got to put like a creepy, elderly lady looking thing, because that's what they did in Mama. That's what this film felt like. It felt like they were trying to copy so many other horror films at once. The best way to describe the problems with the story is that it felt like they had an idea that probably would have worked better as a short film, but then they decided to pad it out to a feature by making it needlessly complicated. While the idea of a haunted mirror isn't all that original, it does open up a great deal of possibilities. However, this film tries to have its cake and eat it too by telling two stories at once, and not even balancing those two stories very well. It should have either just been an Amityville horror style of horror film from the kids' perspective, or a film like The Haunting with the grown-up perspective, and kind of leaving it up to the viewer's interpretation of whether or not it is in their head or not. Just one or the other. Don't try to like mix them both together, because then you just have certain scenes and certain things that are supposed to be echoing one another just not making sense to the overall presentation. From a technical standpoint, the film presents itself pretty well. I mean, the cinematography is good and some of the visual effects were also pretty good. The editing was confusing, but that's more of a problem with the screenplay than with the actual editing itself. Overall, this film is just a nightmare of haphazard editing, confusing pacing, and needlessly shoehorned elements from other films like The Shining and Final Destination. It also doesn't help that a great deal of the actions taken by the characters and just some facets of the overall premise just don't hold up when you apply even the most basic common sense. And I know what you're thinking, oh, it's a horror film, it's not supposed to have common sense. No. No. It's kind of the same thing where I keep hearing the stupid people going, oh, something can be so bad it's good. No, that is not something you should be striving for. And the whole, just because everybody's doing it does not mean it's a good idea. It's just, gah. I keep getting sick of having to explain this to people, but there have been examples of horror stories where characters have acted logically and it still works. Look at The Thing, for example, and I'm talking like the John Carpenter film, or even the original short story Who Goes There? That's an example of a story where characters being logical can still make something scary. There was potential in the premise, but the story really needed focus, and while there aren't really any major technical failings, this film is just not worth seeing even at a dollar theater matinee. You're better off just waiting for this to come to Netflix. That said, I give Oculus a 2 out of 5. So that's it for this episode of Romney's Reviews, and unless I have any more NDAs that I have to sign, tune in tomorrow for my review of Disney's Bears. See you then.